Hi, it's Richard here from Intelligent Advisor IT Consulting, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for the fourth chapter in this series about decision services. This chapter is all about modeling rules, and we're going to focus on the good, the bad, and the ugly so that you are confident when you begin writing rules for decision services. Just as in previous chapters, at the end of the presentation, there will be a demonstration of the key features that we've talked about. Let's take a look at the agenda. We're going to break it down into four different pieces. In the first part, we'll look at some terminology changes, and we'll also look at the basics of writing Boolean and non-Boolean rules, things that you need to know before you get started. Then we'll look at the specifics of writing rules in blocks. Now, you've already begun to meet the concept of a block. You've seen that in two previous chapters. And we're gradually increasing the level of complexity. But basically, in this chapter, we will focus on what it takes to write simple rules in blocks. We'll also revisit the idea of error messages and how they're related to the blocks that you type in. Finally, we'll investigate the new type ahead feature and functions in your rules. In the next chapter after this one, we'll talk about tables, and then in a later chapter, we'll talk about objects, the two slightly different kinds of block that you will meet in a decision service. So let's start with this introduction. Three things really. Terminology that has changed, and then we'll look at the basics of Booleans and non-Booleans, things that you need to be aware of before you start. In terms of terminology, you will probably have noticed that in the documentation, you don't find the word attribute anymore when referring to decision service elements, with a few minor exceptions when you're creating blocks. But you'll recall from the previous chapter that you create contract items. So you create input and output items, and each of those items has a name, and it also has some natural language text. So you'll recall from the previous chapter that I had things like the first input, and then that had a name of first underscore input. You'll see those referred to as field names, and they show up in the run with rest. So you need to know that there are some restrictions when creating field names. They must be starting with an A to Z character or an underscore, and they can only contain a subset of the full character set. I'm not going to read them all out, but you can read them there. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the basics of Booleans, first of all. The basic idea is the same as Oracle Policy Modeling, with a few minor changes, which we'll show you in the next slide. But let's focus first of all on what is similar or the same. Look at the screenshot. I have a Boolean conclusion, the customer is refunded, if, and then I have all. So that's important for you to know that you can use any or all to group conditions together. And you'll also notice if you look underneath the all that the elements have been indented. They are further away from the left-hand margin. So indentation is used in a similar way to what you already know. The thing that's missing, of course, is the coloring. So we don't have colors for indentation. There are a few minor restrictions, such as if you're going to use the grouping, such as any or all, then that needs to be on a separate line. And if you're using and or, these should be on a separate line as well. We'll see both of those in the demo. Still on the subject of Boolean rules, here is probably the most important difference. Unlike Oracle Policy Modeling, Boolean fields do not recognize negation. That is, the negative is not understood. So if I write the customer is happy and then I use the customer is not happy in some other rule, they will be considered to be two different fields. The way to create a negation is to use the not function. You can also, if you wish, use true or false directly. So you could say the customer is happy equals true, or the customer is happy equals false, which will set the Boolean value of your field. But if you're trying to adapt your style, remember to use the not function. Moving on to non-Boolean rules, there are essentially three ways to write non-Boolean rules in decision services. You could have a simple assignment, so something equals, and you can see in this case I'm using a text field, so the text values have to have double quotes. So if you're used to doing single quotes or in programming, you'll need to make sure you use double quotes. You can use an arithmetic style. So in the second screenshot, you can see that I have a numeric expression. The customer refund voucher value equals the value of the product minus, and you'll notice that I have there, I've put a dollar sign and $1.50, so $1.50. A couple of things you need to know about this. First of all, you must have spaces. A space is needed either side of the hyphen, so the minus sign, or if you're using the slash for division or what have you, you need to make sure that you provide a little bit of space. Secondly, you'll also notice that the dollar sign is there. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but because that's a number, the dollar sign is acceptable. Finally, we have the third style of writing non-Booleans, which is to use a function. And in this case, of course, there's very little difference to what you're probably familiar with Oracle Policy Modeling. The function itself might be different, but the way to write the rule is the same. Still on the subject of non-Booleans, unlike Oracle Policy Modeling, there are only 4 data types available. There's Boolean, string, number, and date. Number fields, as you saw in the previous screenshot, you can use the dollar sign, so you can use currency formatting. But because decision services are currently only in US English, the dollar sign is the only currency sign that you're allowed to use. So here are 4 examples. The product number equals 10, that's a numeric value. The product refund value equals $10. So there's an example of using a number field with currency formatting, but it's still a number. The date of response equals add days, the date of the order 10. So that's a traditional Oracle Intelligent Advisor function. And then we have, it's a Boolean, but I thought I'd put it in for a reminder. The credit is given equals true. So you can set the value of a Boolean field just by making it equal to true or equal to false. Still on the subject of non-Booleans, if you're going to use a date, the date needs to be in the region-free format that you're probably very familiar with if you've ever used the Oracle Policy Modeling debugger. Year-month-day. So those basic principles when you create rules, now you need to apply them to your actual decision service. You write rules inside a block. Each block can contain as many rules as you wish, but technically speaking, the rules have to be from the same scope, which we'll discuss later. But if you come from Oracle Policy Modeling, you'll be familiar with the idea of scope, is that if you have, in Oracle Policy Modeling, you have a global scope, and then you have an entity. Maybe you have an entity called the person, and that in itself is a scope, and maybe you have a child entity called the pets of the person, and that is itself a scope. It's a contextual thing. So each block has a context. You'll notice in the screenshot that the context of the block is written in the black header. It says calculated once per case. And then there's a little triangle to have a drop down. So that's where you set the context or the scope of a block. It's only relevant if your decision service contains objects. If your decision service doesn't contain any objects, then you don't have to worry about it, because it's a bit like having an Oracle Policy Modeling project where everything is in the global scope. There's no need to think about scope because there is only one scope. Within a block, you can add blank lines, you can have inline comments, and you can mix and match Boolean and calculation rules as well, for that matter, as tables and any other kind of rule. So although it's good practice to organize your work into rules, and perhaps you'll come up with best practice and say that if you put a table in a block, then it should be the only thing in a block. That's your choice. That's not something imposed by blocks. If a table exists in the same context as all these rules, you could put a table right in the middle of this block here. One thing that new users struggle to get used to is the fact that it's entirely normal to receive error messages as soon as you start writing in your block. The provided templates, so when you use the little three dots and you add a new block, there'll already be a rule in the block. Or if you add a table block or if you add an object block, there will already be template text inside the block. So you can begin by either deleting that or begin just by overwriting it. But in any case, if you haven't created contract items, or if the contract items, you mistype something in your block, or if the contract hasn't been made at all, then you're going to see red errors. And you're going to eliminate red errors by using type ahead, which allows you to select the contract item, or you're just going to pay attention and make sure that you have the same spelling. Finally, we just briefly touched on the idea of type ahead, is that when you are typing inside a block, if your text matches any existing contract item, a drop-down will appear for you to select the item. If you're familiar with the Rule Assistant from Microsoft Word, then this concept will be familiar to you. It kind of helps you, so it makes a suggestion. The other thing I want to talk about is functions. The range of functions is different to Oracle Policy Modeling. There are many less functions in general, and there are actually certain categories of function that are completely absent. There are a couple of new functions as well, but just sort of to de-dramatize that, some of the differences can be put down to the nature of decision services, because there's no interviews in a decision service. So some functions don't make any sense in that context. And some can be put down to changes how we handle data. The concept of temporal reasoning, for example, does not exist in a decision service. So all the interval and the temporal from functions are not present because there's no such functionality. Here's a screenshot showing you how the type ahead will work. On the right-hand side, I'm just beginning to type out a rule inside a block, and I've entered the word the, and up pops a drop-down with all of the different attributes that exist in my decision service that include the word the, so I can then freely select from the drop-down. On the left-hand side, you can see that I've begun typing a function, and the drop-down proposes the function and also gives me a little tooltip to remind me what the function arguments are for. So very similar to the Rule Assistant. On the subject of writing rules in general, copy and paste works fine between different blocks in the same session. Don't attempt to open multiple sessions of the same service. If you do, you'll get into something like this because somebody has saved something ahead of you, and this should be familiar to those of you who've ever had a conflict in Oracle Policy Modeling. But as a basic rule, one user should work on a decision service at any given time, because when those saves fail, well, you just have to either back out of your changes, load it up again, or tell the other person to finish their work and close the editor so that you can open it. But bottom line is you want to avoid having multiple people working on it at the same time. Still on the subject of functions, one thing that surprises people is that the current date or the current date does not exist. So the decision service doesn't support the idea of the current date. As such, you will need to have an alternative approach. For example, specify that the date is an input contract item and receive that date from an external application. Once you have a date, of course, you can use the existing functions, which include the ever popular add days, add years, and so on. So what do I want you to remember from this chapter? Well, I want you to remember that there's some good stuff. I think that the type ahead and the drop down when you're writing rules is pretty good. There's some bad stuff, or at least there's some challenging stuff, such as you have to get used to certain functions not being available, and you have to become more familiar with writing rules in blocks. And then there's the ugly. When you begin, it can feel very ugly that you've got red lines and errors everywhere. But that's because, as we saw in the previous chapter, you need to adjust how you write the rules and begin, in my opinion, with creating the contract items so that the contract is ready before you write any rules. Coming up in the demonstration, we'll see all of those different items and we'll talk through some of the behavior of the Decision Service Editor. See you for the next chapter. So in the first part of our demo, we're going to remind you about field names, and we're going to look at Boolean and non-Boolean field creation and usage in rules. So I'll go ahead and create a new project. We'll call this chapter 4. And the first thing we're going to talk about is creating fields in contracts, so input and output. So let's begin by creating a new rule. Customer is always right if the customer pays the bill. So when it comes to adding elements to the input and output, the first thing that you need to be aware of is that, for example, if we have our input attribute here, our input field here, click input and choose Boolean. The first item here is the field name, so you can think of this as the technical name. So I'm going to call this customer bill. And the second part is the natural language version, if you will. And I'll click done. And then the same is true for our output field, which we'll put here, Boolean. And so this is customer right, and the customer is always right. So now if I go ahead and commit a version and switch to run via REST, you can see here in the try it section that it's the first part, so it's the name that is given here, and the name is given in the output. So make sure when you're building your contracts and you're creating your fields that you think about making sure that this is the part that will appear in the REST API and this is the internal part. So the second thing I wanted to talk about, which we discussed in the chapter, is that when we create a rule such as the customer is happy if the package is delivered successfully, and I'll go ahead and just quickly add this as an input field. There we go. That when we're dealing with Booleans, we have to remember that it is not like Oracle policy modeling, and this would not be considered as a negation. It would simply be considered as a new field, which is why it's suddenly woken up and said there's a problem, because I don't get what this is. However, if we were to use the not function, there's not a problem because it's understood what we mean by the not. And if we do one final one, this is also perfectly acceptable when building rules using Boolean fields in decision services. Our final example will be involving a non-Boolean field, and we'll also mention a function. So let's imagine that we have in our input contract, we have the date today. We're receiving that as an input because, as we mentioned in the presentation, there is no function to return the current date. So we have to assume that you're receiving this as an input value. So we could do something like the customer's age equals, and we'll use a function which you probably already know, which is year difference. So you can see that the type ahead feature pops up with the valid with functions that include the word year, and we can see year difference, date 1, date 2, returns the number of years between date 1 and date 2. The order of the two dates does not affect the result. So we can click that, and we see that it's highlighted date 1. So we'll use our input attribute, the date today, as date number 1, and date number 2, we'll call it the customer's date of birth, which of course, assuming we are going to use it this way, we will also need to have as an input and we'll also put the customer's age as an output field as well. We'll commit that version, and we'll switch to run via REST. I'm just using run via REST for demonstration purposes. It's slightly easier to see. We could, of course, go into live mode and try it out as well. So we need to provide the customer date of birth. So we'll provide the customer date of birth. And we'll provide today's date. And we can see that the customer's age is 52. So we are able to use a function, but in this case, as you saw, today's date had to be provided as an input because we don't have a function such as the current date to handle it. See you in the next chapter.